See that people are joining us here for the virtual speaker session presented by the Penn State Alumni Association. As always, I'd love to know who is joining us and where you're joining from. Go ahead and activate your chat box and let us know your name and your Penn State class year and where you're zooming in from today. We have a great program set up for you on the virtual speaker session today, and we are looking forward to getting that started in just a minute or two. Welcome to the virtual speaker series presented by the Penn State Alumni Association. I see Ellen Nowitzki, class of '80 from Emmaus, Pennsylvania. I had a roommate in college from Emmaus. He called it E-Mouse. So good to see you. Bessie Ayala, class of 2014. Bessie's joining us from Washington, D.C., a graduate of UP and Penn State Berks, or at least spent some time at Penn State Berks down there. And welcome to those of you who are watching us on Facebook. We are live on Facebook today as well. We will be getting started in just a moment or two, trying to let our participants join us here in the Zoom room. I see you, Jen Longnecker, class of 2006 from Annville-Cleona School District. Welcome. All right. Good to see the Zoom room filling up. We'll get started in just a moment. Where else would you rather be than a Zoom full of Penn Staters? Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session, which is being recorded. Live closed captions are available for this event. You can access them by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom video window, and then clicking Show Subtitle. You can also customize your caption view by clicking the Stream the Text link posted in the chat. We are live streaming today's presentation, and this live stream has been made possible through the gracious support of a donor and the Fund for Access, Ideas, and Audacious Goals. Today's presentation will be archived and available on our website after the event. This afternoon, we welcome Dr. Wendy Coduti, who is an associate professor in the Rehabilitation and Human Services program here at Penn State. She has a master's degree in human resource management and labor relations and a doctorate in Rehabilitation Counselor Education, both from Michigan State University. She is a co-director of the WorkLink Penn State program and serves on the Pennsylvania Disability Integration Taskforce. Dr. Coduti's research interests include postsecondary students with disabilities, disability management, and mental health in the workplace. The employment rate of people with disabilities has historically remained low, even after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The goal of the Rehabilitation and Human Service program at Penn State is to advocate for people with disabilities through teachings, research, and service. Dr. Wendy Coduti's work focused on employment and disability. She is the co-founder of WorkLink, which I just mentioned, which is a 2-year certification program for people with intellectual disabilities. She has also developed an employment strategy for people with disabilities course. This presentation will provide an overview of that work and where more work is needed to be done to change stigma and bias around disability and employment. It's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual speaker series, Dr. Wendy Coduti. Wendy?
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to share my screen with everybody, and we'll get the presentation started. So thank you all for being here. It's really exciting whenever I get the opportunity to talk about disability, and especially around the ADA, as we're celebrating the anniversary of the ADA. I was telling the folks who were setting up this through the Alumni Association that on any one of these topics I could talk for days and days. So it was kind of difficult to shorten it into a approximately 10-minute presentation, but as always, I'll include my email at the end. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might think of down the road as well, or if you're looking for connections. So what I'm going to talk about today is employment and people with disabilities and why the ADA isn't enough. And the ADA, I'll talk about where it started in 1990 and it was amended in 2008. So what the ADA does, and we think about it often in relation to just employment, and that was a very significant part of the ADA, but there was also parts within the ADA that covered work, school, transportation, and all public and private places open to the general public. So there's some very specific pieces within that legislation, but what I want to focus on is how the ADA related to employment. When I say the ADA, I'm talking about the ADA, but instead of having all of those, the American with Disabilities Act as amended is kind of too long to say. So I will be referring to it from the 2008 when the amendments happened. So the ADA was amended in 2008 to really broaden the definition that came to light in 1990, and to make sure that when people were using the ADA, especially around employment, that the discussion wasn't on, do you really have a disability? So what the amendment tried to do is to clarify that and to make more clear-cut the definition of disability, which took us a while to get there, but we're working on it. And it's important when we think about the ADA in employment that it's actually a three-pronged approach, that somebody has to meet one of these criteria: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities, a record of such a disability, or conditions regarded as having a disability. So in order to meet that definition, it's that three-pronged approach. And when we talk about the ADA and employment, the person has to be qualified for the job. I think there was a lot of misconceptions early on and a lot of fear from employers that I'm going to have to hire anybody with a disability, but the ADA is very clear that the person with a disability has to be qualified for that position. So it's taken us a while around disability. There's always stigma, there's always myth, there's always confusion. So it's taken us a little while to get there, but we're making great strides. But as you see, we have a long way to go. So this slide right here, to me, in the employment strategies with people with disabilities class that I teach, this graphic is our classroom spotlighting canvas. This is a graphic I use for the class because to me, it really highlights what the ADA has done in certain ways, but then where we still have so much work to do. There's a great disability rights activist, Mary Johnson, and she said, a law cannot guarantee what a culture is not willing to give. So even though we have the ADA, which is law has allowed for more opportunities for people with disabilities to find employment, you can see from this graph that that wasn't the case. So if you look at the red part of the graph is people with disabilities, the blue part of the graph is people without disabilities, and that's their employment rate. So I'll ask students, what did you expect when the ADA came out in 1990 or in 2008? Do you think the employment rate for people with disabilities increased or decreased? And most people think, well, it increased. That's not the case. So for me, that really highlights that the ADA is a stepping stone, but there's other pieces that we have to we have to build if we want to increase that rate for people with disabilities in employment. Historically, it's always hovered around, I'd say 36%, 35 to 38% roughly, the employment rate for people with disabilities. And as we've seen with previous recessions, a Great Recession, with the significant impacts we've seen in employment with COVID, that for people with disabilities, they're more significantly impacted whenever there's any type of downturn in the employment structures we're seeing right now. The other thing that I think it's important is that we normalize disability. I spend about 4 weeks in my class, the first 4 weeks, to get students to really care about disability and work. And how I do that is I get them to think about how they're going to be impacted by disability. And for many 20-some-year-olds, they don't think about that. They think they're young, they're healthy, they never have to worry about disability and how it might impact their future careers. So why we should care about people with disabilities? People with disabilities are the largest minority population in the world. Anywhere from 15 to 20% of the population has a disability. The other reason why we should care is we're all temporarily abled. Disability is the only minority group that you can enter into at any time. We never know when we're going to acquire an injury, disability, disease, an accident that could make us disabled. So it's really important that we think about that and have a plan for how will we secure our own employment down the road. 1 out of 4 20-year-old individuals will become disabled before they retire. And I've included some of these. I'm not going to read all of the data on my slides, but I wanted to provide you with some additional information to put this into some context. A majority of the reasons why people become disabled is not related to work. So oftentimes we think if you have an injury, illness, disease, there's protections in place, there's safety nets through our disability plans. But it's important to understand that 51 million workers in the US do not have disability insurance. So it's important that we understand how we all can be impacted by this in some way or another. And as you'll see, I included, it's kind of an update from that chart on the previous slide that had information on employment rates. In 2018, the employment rate for people with disabilities was about 37% compared to 80% of people without disabilities. The other reason why we should care, and I like to look at this from the employer's perspective, it's kind of hard, not if you're like me, somebody coming from the business world or from human resources, to not think about this. And we have to think about the employer and how employers are impacted. And I've included some information, some stats on here specifically around mental health, because anxiety and depression are the leading causes of disability in the employment. So short-term disability, long-term disability, and it's estimated to cause about 200 million lost workdays each year. So mental health in the workplace is something that we have to really pay attention to, especially with everything that's going on right now. The other piece that I like to include when I talk about disability in the workplace is creating mentally healthy workplaces. We have to make sure that when we're going into work, when I do presentations for employers, I always tell them, every day your employees walk in the door, you're either making them or you're breaking them. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to support your employees, because if you have a toxic work environment, if you have a mentally unhealthy work environment, you're going to pay for it in one way, shape, or form. I think it's also important that we remember when we talk about the ADA, it doesn't just protect people with disabilities who are looking for a job. Oftentimes we think of somebody who doesn't have a job who's looking for work and how they can be protected under the ADA. But we have to always remember those people that are currently working with a disability. They may have an invisible disability like mental health condition, and how they can use the ADA to help them get accommodations and to help them get the supports and resources they need to maintain their employment. So for me, that's always a big piece. It's not just the people who have a disability and who aren't working, but how do we take care of the people with disabilities who already have a job? And to me, that's the biggest pocket of folks that really don't get a lot of attention. So different barriers in the workplace, you might think, well, we have the ADA, that chart hasn't increased much. What's some of the issues? And this is a multi-pronged approach, and I'll get to that in a couple of slides. But one of the biggest barriers is stigma and myths around what people can and can't do. There's a lot of concern for employers of how much disability will cost, how much will that accommodation cost me, what type of supports will this person need? They're going to drive my costs up. And that's not the case. So for me, it's important that when we talk about employment and disability, that we talk about some of those barriers and how can we eliminate some of that stigma that exists. So I want to talk about what are we doing here at Penn State. So you heard Paul mention the WorkLink program. That's a program that me and my colleague, Dr. Allison Fleming, started a few years ago. We're in the third year of a 3-year grant from the DREAM Partnership, which was great to help us get started. We currently have 3 students that are in their second year, and we have 4 new students that are in their first year. And what WorkLink is, there's about 290 programs like this across the country. So it's nothing new, but it's new to Penn State University Park. So it helps students with intellectual disabilities who have traditionally been neglected by higher education have opportunities to attend post-secondary education like their peers. What we did is we created a 2-year certificate program through our WorkLink program that's all focused on employment, hence the name WorkLink. The goal is to obtain and retain employment, especially for this population that has significantly lower employment rates when compared to all other disabilities. The other pieces that we do is not just the career experiences and career preparations, but helping students with self-advocacy, self-determination, independent living, social inclusion. And that's something that we're very proud of, is getting our students in and giving them that opportunity to be just like everybody else at Penn State. And they've taken it and they've run with it. It's been a great 2 years so far. We weren't expecting a pandemic, but we've been flexible and we're still moving forward. So why do we need programs like WorkLink? Students with intellectual disabilities are left behind after graduation. Like I mentioned, very high levels of unemployment, less opportunity to build their network. And this is really important. You either network or you not work. This is one of the things that I try to drive home in my classes that I teach. And that for a majority of people, they find their job through the people that they know. I always push the alumni network. I let them know that the Penn State alumni group and Penn State alumni overall is their best network to reach out and build for any of my students when they're getting ready to graduate. I tell them use that to help build your own careers and moving forward. The other thing that's really important about WorkLink is that it really benefits Penn State overall, not just for us for including disability as part of diversity, but also for our students that work with us in a volunteer capacity, mentor capacity, internship capacity, for our Penn State students that are looking at getting careers in this type of environment. They get to work with us while they're still students at Penn State. And we wouldn't be able to make it without them. I can tell you that for sure. The other thing that I have that I've worked on is an employment strategies course. So when we think about how do we increase that employment rate for people with disabilities, so we have to have policy, we have things like the ADA. We also have to have opportunities for training people with disabilities, such as our WorkLink program, but we also have to have ways to train and to educate employers. And there's different methods for doing this. When I created the class, I wanted to make sure that I cross-listed it with human resources. Because our RHS, our Rehab and Human Services, those are the folks who are going to be going and helping people with disabilities in all areas of their life, including employment. Also within our master's program for clinical rehab and mental health for students who are going into vocational rehab. So the RHS side, we had that covered with the people who were going to be working with people with disabilities. It was very important for me coming from HR to include the human resources students in this class. And I try to keep it about a 50-50 split. So in this class, we don't just look at disability and employment from the person with disability side, but we also look at from the employer side of how can we build that diversity through hiring people with disabilities? How can we create policies and procedures to keep people with disabilities employed? How can we create mentally healthy workplaces so we're not breaking our employees? So this class is, you know, I get excited every night. I get to teach it on Monday nights. We had a great class last night talking about how people with disabilities have been impacted because of COVID and employment. And I'm always amazed at how how excited the students are to go out and be that change. So when I developed this course, I looked at it, like I said, from a multi-pronged approach. So we look at understanding how people with disabilities are impacted with having less opportunities to secure lifetime employment. The U is the student. So again, I try to get my students to think about how this is going to impact them. Because if I tell them, if I can't get you to care about this, you're not going to go out and hire somebody with a disability. You're not going to get into the workplace and change your policies, your interviewing strategies, your recruitment strategies. So I really have to get the students to care about how they're going to be impacted on their own, because when they think about how it's going to impact them, then they're much more willing to go make those changes. Although the Penn State students are a little bit different, because if there's a problem, they want to go solve it. That's the one thing that I learned having come here 8 years ago. So I try to use that in my class as much as possible. The other piece when we look in this class is, like I said, from that HR side and from that rehab side, and in the middle is kind of where that class lies. So I always use this graphic as a way to describe what the heck this class is about, because oftentimes it can be a little bit confusing, or if HR students are trying to figure out why should I take this, this helps them get a better understanding of that. And this is the model we have to take if we really want to get that red line in that graph increased. We have to look at this as a multi-pronged approach, not just relying on policies such as the ADA is our kind of like our foundation of our house. That's what gives us that solid base. Now all of these are different scaffolding to help increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So different topics that I cover in this class, accommodations in the workplace. The big piece that we really look at is how do we use the ADA as kind of like a manual for understanding how do I ask for an accommodation? How do I support somebody asking for an accommodation? What do I have to provide or not provide as an employer? Where can I learn about offering different types of accommodations, and where do I even start? So my goal is to spend time giving students all the resources that they need. So if something happens where they get an injury, illness, disability, disease, and are taken out of the workplace, they now have the tools to continue that lifetime employability. And in turn, I always tell them, you know, the only goal that I have for you guys upon graduation is to go out and change the world. Take this information and go in whatever capacity you're entering into your careers, make sure that you're advocating for people with disabilities. And they do a great job of that. So those are just some of the different topics that we look at, different populations, disabilities law, insurance, and also getting employers to understand how to build these programs that support people with disabilities in their workplace. So that is all that I have. I believe that there was some additional questions.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for your presentation. And we have some questions that were submitted. If you would like your question to be asked, you can go ahead and submit that into the Q&A box. We will take questions that are in the Q&A box for Dr. Coduti. But let's maybe take a step back with and kind of reset with maybe just a basic definition of disabilities, or what's covered under American with Disabilities, because it seems like it's a wide spectrum of things that are covered under the legislation.
And that was purposeful with the amendments back in 2008. So within that, they actually described what is an activity of daily living, what is an essential part of independent living. We had a lot of time spent discussing those definitions instead of do you have a disability or not have a disability. Basically what it comes down to, and how I try to explain it, is if you have a diagnosis. If you have a diagnosis, or if you previously had a diagnosis, say if you were somebody who had cancer, but it's in remission, you're still protected under the ADA because you're regarded as having a disability. You fall under that three-pronged approach that I mentioned. Or if you're somebody that's regarded as having a disability. So it covers mental health, it covers physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, anything with a diagnosis, it's not short term. So if you fall and break your leg, you're not covered under the ADA.
Right.
But if it's something that's a permanent disability, then you are.
So can you talk a little bit about, like, you went back to your chart where you talked about 90% employment of people without disabilities, and then it went from 50% down to, I believe, just north of 30% for people with disabilities. Could some of that percentage change be attributed to the definition being more broadened? Not that that's to say that there's not a problem, right? But to say a downward trend after we've made such a commitment and such a stark trend is eye-opening to some of our participants today.
Yeah, I don't think you can attribute it to any one thing. I think there's multiple reasons why. I think, especially, I tried to tell students when I was in HR and we talked about the ADA, it was how not to get sued. How do you protect yourself as an employer, instead of looking at the ADA of how can I expand my workplace to include more diversity. So just because you have the law in place, it takes a long time for that cultural shift to occur. So I think, you're right. Whenever we expand a definition and include more people, then those numbers might change on the graph. But, statistically, it's been right around that 35%. With dips up and down, but nothing significant.
Right. So any suggestions for people with high ability and maybe slow processing speed and employment, or well, let's stick with that one for a second. Ellen has submitted that question, and then I'll go on to a couple others.
Okay. So I guess what's meant by high ability, low processing? I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. Is it regarding a specific disability type?
It's not. That's how the question was submitted. The way that I'm interpreting it might be significant kind of intellectual capacity, and yet I think of severe stutter as an example, right? It's not necessarily an indicator of mental capacity,
Right.
but it does slow down their ability in the workplace to get messages across.
Right.
As an example.
Okay. Yeah. And I think there's, again, multiple pieces to that. Technology has increased significantly. We have so many different types of accommodations on your phone. You've got so many pieces that before you needed a big piece of equipment to come in for, say, text to speech, or if you needed to have a piece of equipment for your assistive technology, your phone now can act like that. So I think there's different ways of looking at what type of accommodations are out there, assistive technology is out there. I think the other piece is educating the coworkers and the supervisor of how best to communicate and how best to solicit communication from somebody who might have that slower processing capability, if that makes sense.
Sure. So one thing, a question here is about best practice for job seekers and guidelines to consider when and if to disclose disability during an application process. And then I have just an observation. It seems like some of our application processes ask a disability question without necessarily intending to ask that question. And I think of the requirement, like, must have a driver's license
Right.
to gain this employment. That would seem like it would eliminate a significant number of people from the potential candidate pool. But some best practices and maybe some things that we can think about on the employment side that we should rethink and eliminate from our process.
Right. So best practices for disclosing it the need for an accommodation, right?
Right. Any best practices for job seekers about guidelines to consider when and if to disclose a disability during the application process.
Yeah, so that's like week 13 in class. So we're coming up to that one. And I always try to prep the students on this because that's a big one. And I think that's a hard question because it really depends on the job, the situation. For a lot of times, people, this comes up during the interview when they're asked a question and they're not quite sure how to respond, or not quite sure. I think for a lot of folks, they just don't know the type of accommodation they might need if it's a new type of job. So I think under the ADA, the biggest thing is, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? So if there is a part of that job that falls under the essential part of that job, and if you know you need an accommodation to do that, you have to disclose that. If you don't disclose it purposefully and after the fact it's found that you did need accommodation for an essential function and you didn't disclose, you could lose that position. So I think the bare bones is, if you need an accommodation to perform one of the essential functions, then you have to disclose that. However, you don't have to give a diagnosis. You don't have to provide a whole background of medical information. What I always tell people, and when I did this because I worked in rehab for years before coming into academia, is I would always try to prep my clients as much as possible. So if that comes up, how are you going to ask for an accommodation? And to try to be prepared as possible. The biggest thing is if you have a solution to the problem that they might think is there. So if I know I need an accommodation to perform an essential function of the job, I can just say, here's what I would need to complete that task. Or here's the piece of, here's how I structure my work in order to make sure I can do that effectively. So there's different ways you can bring that up, but many employers will ask that question. Can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? And this is where that training part comes on the HR side of, if somebody says yes, then what do I do? What questions can I ask or not ask? So a lot of it depends on the employer too. And oftentimes, if somebody does answer yes to that, a best practice would be for that employer to then say, okay, talk with our HR folks, and to take the hiring team out of that picture, and then have that individual work with HR to identify what type of accommodation would be needed.
Yeah. So I know we focus a lot on the employment side of the ADA, but there's also, it also extends into other parts of our life. I think of the educational piece of it. So a question has come in: how should high school students best update their 504 plans as they enter college or the workforce?
That's a good question. And I've done a lot recently with helping through that transition period. So a lot of questions come from parents or caregivers of, how do I get my student ready for college if they have a disability? And I think it's so individualized that you have to understand, what are the needs of that student? Will they need an accommodation in college? Going out and meeting with their disability services offices right away. I tell students and parents, if you're getting ready for college, you're looking at 3 different universities, you have a disability, make sure you go visit the Office of Disability Services. Find out what's their process for registering as a student with a disability. What type of accommodations do you think you need? What type of supports are available? And because that's very significant. So I think the biggest thing is knowing what you're going to need entering college, and finding out. That's where that advocacy comes in, is finding out how to ask for that. We know about half of all students with disabilities upon entering college don't get registered because the process is complicated, or they might feel like they don't need that accommodation anymore. They want to do it on their own. The stigma attached to that. So it's a complex situation.
You know, I was talking to you about a friend that I have who does a lot of work in this space. And one of the things that she repeatedly says that makes sense is that, you know, accommodations for the ADA population actually makes it a better workplace for all. There are things that are just that, you know, they are put in place because of people with disabilities, and yet it makes moving around the office easier for everybody. It makes walking down the street and crossing the street easier for everybody. So in that in kind of in that spirit, In what effective and sensitive ways can people with disabilities and organizations provide support and accommodations without people with disabilities having to necessarily reveal details about protected healthcare information? And we've seen this with COVID-19, right? Underlying health conditions weren't something that people talked about as a reason for not wanting to go to work or being hesitant about being around other people. Before COVID-19, we didn't worry about that. Now we worry about that all the time because of how COVID attacks people with comprised immune systems.
Mm-hmm.
But now people have to disclose so much more about their personal health situation than they ever had. So what can we do proactively to create an environment where people don't have to disclose that kind of stuff and still have an environment where there's accommodations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of approaches, and I'll take it first, the pre-COVID answer to that, and that would be creating what's called universal design. So how do we create space? How do we create classrooms so that I'm making it as accessible to everybody? So if you think of, if you have a building and that building has steps, it has ramps, or it's got a sloped entrance to begin with, then you don't necessarily need to have a handicapped accessible ramp if the building is designed so that anybody who needs to enter it can enter it. That's what universal design concept is. If employers started thinking about that in how they design their workplace, there wouldn't be a need for so many people with disabilities to ask for an accommodation. And that's one of the exercises we actually do in my classes is I break them into groups and I give them different types of disabilities. And they have to go, it's the Job Accommodation Network. This is a great resource for anybody that's looking for accommodations, or if you have a disability and you're wondering what type of accommodations you could get, it's the Job Accommodation Network. And I have students go to the Job Accommodation Network and I have them identify a couple of different accommodations that somebody with that disability could request. But then I have them say, now, I want you to say how that benefits not just the person with a disability, but how does that benefit the general workplace? How does that benefit the people without disabilities? So oftentimes we find flexible work environment is needed for certain disabilities. Everybody wants a flexible work environment. So if employers just created a flexible work environment, you wouldn't need somebody with a disability coming in and asking for that. If you set up maybe you have daily briefings of, here's the goals that we're gonna do today. If the calendars are color coded, if there's, like you said, if the office is set up so it's ergonomic, so you have those lift desks. Those are fantastic because it doesn't matter if you're a wheelchair user, you don't have to buy a special piece of equipment. You have those standing desks. So if we think about universal design and how can we create the workplace to be to benefit everybody, oftentimes that automatically takes out the need for a lot of accommodations.
So we've talked about, at least you talked about it in your presentation, and then in my introduction, we talked about the course that you have designed around this, which I think is fantastic. But it also strikes me that that these concepts need to be infused across curriculum. I think of arts and architecture, right? I think of construction management. I think of software developers and 508 compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about how your work is also ensuring that that ADA is part of curriculums all across campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was my main goal of making sure that it was a class that is accessible to as many students as possible. And I'll get students that might take it for an elective from maybe accounting or something because they have a minor in something, and I'll explain to them no matter what job you have, every single job, you're going to be coming in contact with people with disabilities. Your product is going to be potentially helping people with disabilities. And if you think of the disability population as a market, which is pretty significant, and being able to create whatever it is that you're selling in a way that's accessible really changes how we start looking at the environment that we're in. I think for me, the biggest thing is so that people can protect themselves, because we know that, and again, this comes from having worked in human resources. I did workers' comp and long-term disability, and I had people sitting across my desk who never expected to be in the situation that they were in. They never expected to have an injury. They never expected to have a cancer diagnosis. They never expected to have a disability. And now they're sitting there trying to figure out, what can I do? And for me, if I can educate as many students as possible of how do you take care of yourself if that happens, and how can you take care of your family members or your spouse or your partner, that's pretty significant, because then they can understand, what am I afforded under the ADA? What can I ask for? Where are my protections? Or where aren't there protections? So I can make sure that I'm not ending up in bankruptcy, which I saw a lot of happen to a lot of people that I worked with in my roles, just because they were never expecting to be in that situation.
When you take a look in the corporate world of companies that are doing a really good job, what are some of the commonalities that are in place, right, to ensure that people with disabilities are in line for promotion, and that they are treated in fair and equitable ways? Are there a couple strategies that those of us who are here that might not be apparent in our workplace that we can immediately enact?
Mm-hmm. And that's a tough one. That comes down to, we talked about this last night of what makes a good employer in this area, and how can we get all the other employers to want to do this? And I think, again, it's a complex issue. So the first thing is for employers to understand that disability is part of diversity. If that's the largest minority population out there, and we really want to create a diverse workplace, we have to include people with disabilities. I think for the companies that are doing this, the thing that we talked about last night in class was moral leadership. So those leaders, those CEOs, those managers, those supervisors that understand that by becoming a better employer to our workers benefits us in so many different ways. It decreases your turnover rates. It decreases your disability costs if you're creating a safe workplace, and if you're accommodating workers so they can come back to work sooner, if you're hiring people with disabilities. So on the business end, it makes business sense to do this. But the big thing is, if employers don't see that, how can we move them in that direction? For me, it's always starting with helping them understand where they're at. So what are their current disability costs? Where could they make improvements? What are they paying for that if they created an accommodation, or if they created a return to work or stay at work program, would save them money on the bottom line? Until we get employers to take care of the people they disable, we're never going to get employers to hire people with disabilities that don't work for them yet. And that was probably the biggest struggle that I had working in, especially when I was working with injured workers, trying to get them back to work. We have to get employers to care about the people that work for them first. And if we can do that and help them understand disability within their current workforce, then we've made it so much easier for them to invite people with disabilities to come work for them.
Absolutely. A friend, again, fellow alumni council member, Mike McHugh, does a lot of work in this space as well at JP Morgan Chase. And so they have a great principles for inclusion for employees with disability in the workplace. So I will put that link in the chat for others that might be interested on this topic. It talks about the concept of how to create an inclusive workplace, the need for champions within the workplace, but ultimately I think it comes down to corporate culture too, right? If DE&I is part of your corporate culture, but that doesn't include people with disabilities, then you have to rethink what DE&I means to your corporate culture to include that. So I just put that link in the chat box. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today. The work that you're doing here at Penn State is fantastic. It's really having an impact on others and preparing our students to go off into the 21st century workplace where this kind of knowledge and skills is a requisite to be successful. And so thank you so much for all you continue to do here to help our students and to help the disabled population.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with everybody.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for joining us here on the Alumni Association's virtual speaker series. If you're interested in more programs, visit our website at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thanks again, and we are
Penn State.